This is a double boiler. When I'm melting wax, I always make sure that I'm using a double boiler. There's water in the bottom, and then there's a container of wax which is in the water. The idea is that the water only gets to a certain temperature before it boils off the steam, and this stops the wax from getting so hot that it ignites. When I am melting wax, I always do it outside, and I make sure that I have a fire extinguisher with me when I'm doing this, and I make sure that nothing is close by which can catch fire. So in case the wax ignites, there isn't a problem. Here I'm using a hook just to be really careful to take the wax off of the double boiler, and be sure not to drop any wax into the flame below, because wax can ignite. Here is the beginnings of a wax cotton project. I'm taking a wide natural bristle brush, and I'm painting the piece of clothing. I'm making sure that I get lots of wax on the clothing and that I cover all of the seams with wax. The wax will cool down and it will become stiff and it will crack. This is okay. At a later point in the process, the wax will be remelted and absorbed by the cloth. See, I've made sure that I cover all of the seams of the piece of clothing with wax, and I make sure that I'm getting lots of wax on the piece of clothing. The material that I would use is, it has to be 100% cotton, and it has to be a tight weave. In my experience, the thicker the material is, the better. So like a thick canvas or something like that is much better for this type of a process. But you can experiment and see what works for you. So I'm painting wax onto the piece of clothing, and I'm making sure that I get wax on the entire piece of clothing. Here's a jacket, and I'm just finishing it up. I'm touching up a few little spots that I missed. If you miss a couple little spots, that's okay for this process, but try and cover the garment with wax. And the key is to have a fair bit of wax. So be liberal when you're applying the wax. Put lots on to the piece of garment, and it'll partially soak into the cloth, but most of the wax will be sitting on top of the cloth. See, I'm opening up the jacket now, and I am going to take the wide natural bristle brush. The wider it is, the faster you can paint the wax onto the piece of clothing, and the more efficient the process is. So I'm making sure that all the seams are covered with wax. See, this garment has a lot of seams, and I need to make sure they're all covered with wax so that it is as water resistant as possible. So I'm looking for spots that I missed, and I'm checking out the seams. The seams are really key. They have to be well waxed. And the idea is that you can use some piece of clothing which is not really a piece of survival clothing, and then you can you have to make sure that the seams are very well waxed, and then you cover it with the wax, and then it will be much more water resistant and wind resistant than before. See, this is what it looks like. See, I've got lots of wax on there. It's, in this case, it's 100% paraffin wax, which I like the most for this process. It's readily available and it's quite cheap. I just use candles. So then once I'm done, I put the piece of clothing, once it's cooled, I put it into a plastic bag. And now you can twist it, the bag shut like this, and knot it. Then you can put it in the sun, and the sun, if it's hot enough, it will already partially melt the wax, which is good. Or you can just leave it inside of this plastic bag, and then you can store it for a sunny day. Say if you're doing this, if you're putting the wax on the piece of clothing on a rainy or on a day which is a little cloudy, and you won't be able to melt the wax using the solar wax melter. So now I take the jacket out of or the set of pants out of the plastic bag, and I'm getting ready to put it inside of the solar wax melter. See, there's a lot of wax on the set of pants, and that's good. The wax is cracking and chipping off, but that doesn't matter because it will be in the solar wax melter very soon, and the wax will remelt, and you'll see what happens. So I'm putting it inside of the solar wax melter now, the set of pants. You can see the wax is starting to crack off a little bit. That's fine. I'm spreading the garment out so that the maximum surface area is exposed to the sun. So now I put some thin acrylic or plexiglass on top. This box had holes in the handles, so I sealed them with aluminum foil. I just squished it into the holes, and that basically seals everything. Now I am taking wood screws and I'm putting them into holes which are at the corners of the solar wax melter. There's a sheet of acrylic on top which has simply been cut using a Dremel tool and a cut-off wheel. I do this outside, and now the solar wax melter is working. It has to be at least 25 Celsius outside or 77 Fahrenheit for this process to work. You need a cloudless sky and you need the sun beating down on the box. So it really has to be a hot day for this to work, or the wax won't melt. But you can see here that after the pants have been in the solar wax melter for a while, maybe half an hour in this case, a lot of it, or an hour, a lot of the wax has melted. The pants look almost as though they've been dipped in water and they are wet. This is simply the wax which is being absorbed into the cotton. The cotton absorbs the wax really, really well. So you can see there's an even coat of wax on, or the garment has been essentially saturated with wax. Underneath, if there's a fold, where the sun doesn't shine, the wax will not be melted at this spot. So you have to turn the garment over and make sure that the unmelted sections of the garment are exposed to the sun. If they're not exposed to the sun, the wax will not melt. So this is a manual part of the process. You have to monitor the garment and keep turning it over once the wax has successfully melted. The reason I'm wearing yellow latex kitchen gloves is because they help protect my hands from the hot wax. It helps a little bit. You'll be surprised at how hot the wax will become in the solar wax melter. It will easily melt the wax if the conditions are right. You can see here the wax is melting off of the garment. It is being wicked up by the cotton. It's a wicking action of cotton and wet or melted wax, and then the excess wax is simply dripping off of the garment into the wax trough below. So this container has to be put on an angle so that the wax will run off of the garment, the excess wax. This is the pants once they are out of the wax melter. They will cool down and then they become stiff as a board. So they're very, very stiff. So now I'm taking a spoon and I'm scraping off any excess wax on the pants. This is very quick, but you'll notice there isn't even that much extra. most of it has just dripped into the wax trough, and I don't even have to scrape it off. So the whole garment is now soaked in wax, and the wax has hardened, and I'm scraping off the excess wax. This is very easy to do. So I've gotten a very even soak, so to speak, and the seams are all soaked in wax, and the wax is hardened. So this garment should be relatively water resistant and quite wind resistant. See, then after this point, the garment has, because it's so stiff, it has to be bent and sort of broken in with the hands. You have to manipulate the material, bend it back and forth, and the material will often become white when you're doing this, but as you're breaking it in, the garment becomes much more flexible. You have to do this or you can't really wear the garment. If it's super stiff, you can't wear it. But you get these patterns sometimes, which look a little bit like camo patterns. They look quite interesting. And sometimes there's a little bit of excess wax on the garment, but that's okay. That'll probably wear off as you're using it. So this this plastic box has to be non-toxic, right? It's just some sort of a plastic non-toxic box, which is has been sealed, so it has to be airtight, and I've used aluminum foil to plug the holes. Many models probably won't even have holes. And then I just cut the acrylic to size and drilled some holes through the acrylic and the lid of the box, and then I just put screws through these holes. It's really very simple. And these are wood screws, and they hold the acrylic in position when it gets tilted. It has to be tilted to face the sun, and it also has to be tilted so the wax will drip to the bottom of the container. So if the acrylic gets a little bit cloudy or dirty from the wax, this doesn't really matter. The solar melter will probably still work just fine. See, that's all it is. A screw through the acrylic and through the plastic box. So you can see the acrylic is thin and it's a little bit flexible. I don't think the thickness of the acrylic matters that much. It just has to be something clear on top of a black box. Now I'm putting the garment inside the solar melter. The box should be black because black absorbs the sun and it absorbs heat, so it gets hotter quicker. Now I spread the jacket out and I expose as much surface area as possible to the sun. Again, I put the flexible acrylic sheet on top, and I put the screws through the holes like that. It's really a very quick process. In this case I use 6 holes, but it might be possible to use just 4 at the corners. 6 is a little bit tighter of a seal. And just watch your hands because the screws will be exposed underneath, and then I tilt it on an angle facing the sun. Remember, it should be on a slight angle. The angle doesn't really matter, it just has to be enough that the wax will run off when it melts. See here, this is some time later, and you can see the wax has melted just like ice, and the cotton's wicking action has absorbed all of the wax it can hold until it is saturated. See, the sun is shining brightly, and this is really, really important. If you don't have a hot sun, then this won't work. I've only tried it in a moderate climate. I don't know how this will work in other climates. So you can see the sun is beating down on the wax garment, and the wax is melting, and the wax is being absorbed by the cotton. Cotton is like a wax sponge, just sucks up the melted wax, kind of like a candle wick. It's exactly the same principle. And this gets you a very even soaked throughout the whole garment. Now I have my gloves on and I'm checking the garment. I just took the bottom screws off, and I flipped the garment over, and the spot that was not exposed to the sun, of course, has not melted. So I make sure that this unmelted wax is now exposed to the sun. This doesn't take very long, and now the garment is ready to keep on melting. I'll come and check back sometime later. Now I'm going to check back and we're going to have a look. You can actually see, if it's really hot, you can almost actually see the wax melting. It happens that quickly. So see, some parts are melted and some parts are not, and this means I have to keep turning the garment and wait until the wax is melted and then turn it again. Now I close the lid and I go off and do something else and check back in a little while. Now I'm looking and I can see that the wax has dripped off of the garment into the wax trough. You can see the excess wax is at the bottom of the trough. It just drips right down, so there's really not much waste. So if you put a lot of wax on the garment, it's just fine. You'll get the whatever you don't use, you'll get back. So here is a look at it from a higher angle, and you can see the sun is beating down and the wax is melting and being absorbed by the cotton garment. I just use any extra garment I have laying around that I don't really need. You can also go to a second-hand shop and get some old cotton garments, but they have to be pure cotton and it has to be a tight weave, and ideally it's thick material. So you can see now it is melting. By this point, the sun has melted most of the wax, kind of like sun melting ice. And I'm checking it again and looking. Yeah, there are some parts where the wax hasn't melted and the wax has sort of caught on the bottom of the container. It's dripped off the garment. The cotton has wicked the wax throughout the garment, and I just remove any excess wax now because this garment has already been soaked with wax. It's really obvious to me that it looks very wet, and if there's a spot that doesn't have wax, I can just take some wax and put it on top of the garment, and the sun will melt it, kind of like ice, and the melted wax will just drip down and soak the spot that doesn't have any wax on it. It's important to coat the entire garment with wax because that makes it waterproof, or should I say water resistant. So you can see here the wax is actually dripping off of the garment. You can watch it drip sometimes if it's hot enough. It just drips down and then it drips into the wax trough, and this gets you a perfect or a very good wax saturation result with very little energy expended and very little work. So it doesn't take that long to do this. You can see it's just dripping and melting. This process is a lot quicker than using a heat gun. It takes a longer time probably, but it takes very little work because most of the time you're not even looking at the box. It's just sitting there in the sun melting, and it takes a little bit of time to check it and flip the garment over, and that's about it. See, now by this point the garment is totally soaked, and I'm just picking off the excess wax, which I now don't need anymore. And sometimes it's even possible to wring the garment like you're wringing water out of a wet piece of clothing, and this can also ensure that the entire garment is soaked in wax. That's really important. See, I'm just wringing it out now. That can also remove excess wax. It's kind of like, think about the garment as a wet garment, but it's coated with wax. So now I'm pushing it to the top of the slope inside the solar melter, and the idea is that the sun is going to keep melting and any excess wax is going to just drip off. So the cotton is now almost fully saturated with wax, and that's the whole point of this process. So you can see as the sun heats up the garment, which is now on the top of the slope, the wax melts and drips down into the wax trough. Then at this point the wax is still usually a bit soft, so you can just use your fingers and peel it out, or remove it using your fingers, and then put the wax back into the melting pot, and you're ready to go again. So there's really very little wax waste in this process. Now I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to scrape the excess wax off using a spoon. You can do this when the pants are, or when the garment is either cold or when it's still warm. It's easier to do it when it's still warm and the wax is partially still melted or soft. So this is what the garment will look like after it's been allowed to cool. See, it is stiff as a board. It's very, very stiff. You can't wear the garment like this. So you haven't done anything wrong if your garment looks like this. Now it's just time to break it in. So you can break it in, and as you fold it, it makes these patterns on it, which almost look like camo or flames. It looks really cool. And if you break in the whole garment, meaning you manipulate all of the parts of the garment will be much more flexible, but it will likely be white. It's easier to make these garments from dark cloth because the dark cloth absorbs the sun better, making melting easier. See how stiff it is? Now I just move it back and forth, and it becomes much more pliable, and it's soft, more like fabric. It's still a little stiff. Some people just wear the garment for a long time and it'll break into, but I just manipulate the cloth or move it around with my hands like this, and the result, I think, is much better like this. So there's a little bit of powder that's formed when you do this, wax powder, so you can sort of dust that off, but that's part of the jacket. I think it'll always stay there. So see, I'm manipulating the entire garment. Every little part of it is getting bent back and forth, and it's getting white, and it's getting much more flexible. So this is 100% paraffin. So you can see I'm just everywhere where there is this sort of stiff wax on the garment, which is the entire garment, has to be bent. So that it's, and after you've done this, see, that's what it looks like. It's kind of a cool design. It looks good, or you can keep going and then the whole garment will be white. This is a touch-up technique using a heat gun and a natural bristle brush. I put the heat gun on low, not high heat, and then I melt the wax on the garment, and then I move the brush back and forth to work the melted wax into the cotton so that the cotton absorbs the wax. And if there's too much wax, I can use a cloth or a spoon to remove the wax. Scrape it off with a cloth, or just simply absorb it with another cotton cloth, the excess wax. When you're doing this, the wax sometimes foams a little bit, and that means that's good. That's fine. And if you see the wax starting to smoke, then remove the heat immediately. So this is a close-up, and you can see I'm moving the paintbrush back and forth, and I'm making sure my fingers are out of the way of the heat gun. And as the wax melts, I just work the wax into the garment. And you can see it melting. This can be used to touch up, or you can do the whole garment like this instead of putting it inside the solar wax melter. But this technique takes a long time. You can see the foam is formed there, and it could take 2 hours to do a garment. It's a good idea to do this outside. I would not do it inside, and I would do it somewhere where if the jacket would potentially catch on fire, that you wouldn't have a problem. That's the best place. So just to be safe, and have a fire extinguisher and a shovel nearby just to take care of any issue that could happen. It's never happened to me yet, but it might be possible. So there it is melting, and I'm moving the brush back and forth quickly to make sure that the wax is evenly absorbed into the garment and into the seams. You can see this takes quite a long time to do this. And again, if there's too much wax, I have more than enough here. I just scrape off the excess wax using a spoon, and then I keep working and melting. You can see it's foaming a little bit. That's all right. So the wax is taken from the top of the garment. This garment has not been put into the solar melter yet, and it is being melted, and it's being worked into the garment. And there's a little bit too much, so I use another cotton cloth and absorb the excess wax. You can see this takes quite a while. This is a close-up here. You can see it melting, and the wax is the brushes move back and forth quickly, and the cotton is absorbing the wax. And then that's basically everything. So the solar melt box will get this result, but with much less work, in my opinion. See, I'm making sure the seam is soaked, and I keep moving the brush back and forth until all the wax is melted. So the top of the wax melts first, and then you keep brushing the wax away and working it into the cotton. And there, I'm removing some excess wax. This is now a test. So this is what the garment looks like when it's done. It looks a little bit white, and it's being worked in, and it's relatively flexible. You can see, and all those seams, those little seams, and all that, the complicated parts of the garment have all been completely saturated by wax, and there should be not much excess wax on this garment. So that's the look. This is again 100% paraffin wax from a melted candle, and now I'm working it in and breaking it in some more using my hands to make the fabric more flexible and more comfortable to use. So you can see the jacket is relatively water resistant. Often the seams don't leak, and you can see the cloth on top of the jacket gets a little wet, but usually there isn't much leakage inside. These jackets can leak, but this process makes them water resistant. Probably not waterproof, but water resistant. You can see that the water just runs off of the garment because water and wax do not attract to each other, and it's kind of like having a jacket made of wax paper. It's a similar effect. You can see the wetness changes the color of the jacket a little bit, but you can see the water is just running off. It's not being absorbed, and the reason it's not being absorbed is because the cotton has already absorbed the wax, and therefore there's no place for the water. Really simple, but it's an interesting technique. So you can see that's all the little complicated parts of the jacket have all been perfectly saturated by wax. And this, using the solar melt box, this doesn't take very much time to do. See, underneath, inside, everything is nicely and evenly saturated in wax, and that's what the garment looks like when it's wet. It gets darker. So you can see even all the little intricate parts that have buttons and all these seams. The seams are usually an area of weakness for they allow water to leak through easier than the rest of the garment, so give special attention to the seams. And you can see there's not much excess wax on this garment, a little bit, and when you hold it up to the light, sometimes it's a little bit translucent. This is a hat, and this is probably 2 parts paraffin, 2 parts beeswax, and 1 part mineral oil. The beeswax smells good, and the mineral oil makes the wax a little softer. These jeans have a similar formulation. You can see the clothing is very flexible, and it feels good on the skin. And these garments also smell quite nice. So you can see it's very, unlike the pure paraffin, it's very soft and very flexible. It doesn't seem to crack at all. But if you have tight jeans, it's very hard to get them on because they sort of stick to your skin a little bit. So you can see that's how it looks. And that's how the material looks. This is thin cotton and the beeswax, paraffin, and mineral oil. You can see it's very soft and flexible. Different formulas or different ratios give a different result. You have to try what you like best. This is another pair of pants. You can see this one is brown and it looks a little different. So you can see there's a little bit of a whiteness on the garment, and again it's very soft. This is also paraffin, beeswax, and mineral oil. That's what it looks like. You can see there's a little bit of extra wax on the outside. It's a little bit oily. So these are the pure paraffin pants. You can see these are green, and you can see they're a lot stiffer, but they're not oily. So again, it has a different result. You can see it's a little bit stiff, and again it has the white markings on it. This is simply paraffin from a candle. It's very easy to get candles. But you have to make sure that the wax is made of paraffin wax. Probably if it has some microcrystalline wax in it, it's probably fine as well. So this one is maybe 20% mineral oil and probably 80% paraffin. So it is a lot different than the pure paraffin. It's very soft, but it's a bit oily. So it's not stiff at all. They used to use fish oil on ship sails to stop the wind from blowing through, and it made them more efficient. So, and then the sailors would make clothing out of the sails that were treated with fish oil, and that's where the term oilskin comes from. So here you can see here's the jacket. That's what it looks like. This is pure paraffin, and it has the patterns on it. You can sort of decide how the patterns will work by creasing it. And if you throw this in the solar melter, it'll you can start all over again. Meaning you can put different patterns on it. The patterns are just where the where the wax gets cracked as you move the cotton clothing. It has to be 100% cotton clothing. Thick, ideally it's thick clothing with a tight weave. So this is paraffin and mineral oil, maybe 20% paraffin and 80% mineral oil. This jacket is pure paraffin, and it is a thin cotton jacket. I noticed it was a little bit powdery, and there's excess wax on the outside. So I had better results with thicker cotton material. But you can see it's perfectly flexible. Here it's just, it has a little bit of paraffin dust on the outside. And when you're done, you can clean up the board. Sometimes if the board is in the sun, the wax starts to melt. And I have a scraper tool. You can use any kind of scraper tool, and then I just clean off the board like this. And you can reuse the wax or just throw it out. But once the board is covered with wax, it's actually really good for making more jackets.